Hello, I'm Christine LeBlanc from East End United, and today is Wednesday, April 8th. And thank you for tuning into our Wednesday evening worship. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the territory upon which that we are gathered today. For many thousands of years, First Nations have sought to walk gently upon this land. Our home is located on a traditional territory of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat people. We acknowledge their stewardship of this land throughout the ages and seek a new relationship with the original people of this land, a relationship that is based on honor and respect. Let us light the Christ candle. We light this candle as a visible reminder of God's presence in our world. Peace and blessings be upon you wherever you are at this moment. I invite you to make yourself comfortable and take a few deep breaths and make space for God in these next few moments. My family will be singing the Peace, Salam, Shalom song, and we hope that you'll be joining us from your own home. I am struck at how different people's experiences are during this crisis. Many of us are bored and lonely and perhaps watching too much TV. And perhaps you have kids at home and anything but quiet is ringing in your everyday life. Or maybe you're working really hard and your workload is very demanding. If you're a frontline worker somewhere, maybe in a grocery store, healthcare center, pharmacy, we just want to lift you up in these days and give you all of our support. Despite whatever differences we may be experiencing in our daily lives at the moment, one thing is for sure. We are collectively going through this and we are going to get out of this together. And when I was reflecting on this and these strange times earlier this week, my thoughts went to a passage in the book of Joshua. And I'd like to share those with you today. The passage is found in Joshua 3, and it's in this narrative where the Israelites are about to cross over the Jordan River. And I think that this narrative came to mind because it's one of the instances that I can think of where God's people, the Israelites in this case, were going through a very difficult and unknown experience collectively. So we'll read Joshua chapter 3, verses 1 to 6 and 14 through 16.
Early in the morning Joshua rose and set out for Shittim with all the Israelites, and they came to the Jordan. They camped there before crossing the river. At the end of 3 days the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place. Follow it, so that you may know the way you should go. For you have not passed this way before. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, a distance of about 2,000 cubits. Do not come any nearer to it." Then Joshua said to the people, "Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." To the priests Joshua said, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass it on in front of the people." So they took up the ark of the covenant and went in front of the people. When the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, the priests bearing the ark of the covenant were in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks through the time of harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still.
The Israelites were in a desert for a very long time, for years. Certainly, some people were happy to stay in a desert because it's all they knew, but the Israelites had been instructed to cross the Jordan River and enter into their promised land. They knew that what they were facing would change their lives forever, and for sure it was scary. Like it or not, they were being pushed into a new wilderness, a new place that they had never been before. When they reached the Jordan River, it was in a flooded state at that time of year, and they ended up camping there for some days. I can only imagine how that must have seemed to them. The thought of crossing the river during flood season, those days where they were encamped on the banks of the Jordan River, allowed for plenty of opportunity to be staring at the thing that scared them the most, day in and day out. Everywhere they looked, they saw something huge, frightening, and scary. It was a really big obstacle, and they could not get away from it. Does this sound familiar to you right now? For these Israelites, the flooded Jordan River and what lay beyond it was probably the scariest thing that they had faced in their entire collective lives. Sometimes I wonder if those people felt overwhelmed by fear, or some other people looking at the river with excitement and maybe anticipating of seeing God at work. I would like to think that life kind of continued unfolding as it does every day. Maybe children were putting their feet in the Jordan River, playing around with danger, and their mothers were yelling at them to get out of there. Undoubtedly, during those days, the Israelite community experienced a lot of different things. One person's experience was not the same as their neighbor's experience, and yet they were all given the same set of instructions. Sanctify yourself and watch for the Ark of Covenant, or God's presence. They were to watch for God's presence, to look for it, to keep an eye out for it. And when they did see God's presence, they were told to follow it. When it came time to cross the river, the priests carrying the ark, which symbolizes God's presence, waded in the water, which was still flowing. Can you imagine with me for a moment what the Israelites might have been thinking? This God who had provided for them for a generation that roamed around in the wilderness. Now this God was being carried in the rushing waters by a handful of priests. What if the river washed them all away? Many of them must have been terrified that God's presence would be leaving them soon. But we know that that's not how this story went down. Because when God calls people into scary and hostile places, God goes there first. God knows that we are in a place that we've never passed through before. We are in the unknown, and yet God goes first and calls us to follow. I know that sometimes it's hard to see God's presence in times like this. And it occurred to me that trying to grasp God's presence and seeing God at work is sort of what occurred to me in my kitchen the other day next to the window when I was preparing breakfast. I have blinds in my kitchen windows, and I could see a bird flittering in the trees behind the blinds. I couldn't see the bird. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew that it was there in the trees. I knew it was there because I could see the movement and the outline and the silhouette. Sometimes I think it's the same thing with God, especially in difficult times. For those of you who feel like your faith is hanging by a thread or that you're filled with doubt, I hope that you'll remember two things. One, you are not alone. And two, God's presence is in this place now and is going before you. I hope that you'll be encouraged to see God, to look for God's presence and action in these odd times, even though all you might see is a flutter of movement or an outline in the shadows. But just enough to know that God's presence is there. And when you catch a glimpse of God's presence, I hope that you'll be able to hold it in your arms and in your heart and carry it within your souls. The Israelites weren't suddenly going to be alleviating all of their fears by crossing the Jordan River. They were headed into a land that was completely unknown, and they had no idea what was waiting for them on the other side, whether that be a land of abundance or warfaring people. These days, we also feel vulnerable, I think, because humanity hasn't figured out how to eliminate this threat, and it's very scary sometimes to recognize that we can be powerless. And it's uncomfortable because money can't fix everything. And our devices, as great as they are, aren't really giving us that true human connection that we need. And we're forced to rely on human goodwill to stop spreading this virus, and that's getting us some mixed results. And yet, God has demonstrated time and time again and that He's chosen to accompany us in all of our journeys. But even more than that, God chooses to partner with us, to partner with humanity and make it a central part of this divine story that is unfolding. Remember that God was carried into the Jordan by a handful of priests. In a couple of days, we'll be reflecting on the Easter mystery more profoundly and in the many ways in which God has partnered with humanity. We do not serve a distant God, a God who just swoops down and fixes all of our problems, although that might be welcome for a few problems right now. But we worship a God who is with us here and now in this very moment. God is in your fear. God is in your boredom. God is in the room with you when someone is grating on your last impatient nerve. God is in your heart, and He is in your isolation. Because of God's forever presence, we are never alone, and there is no isolation from God. There may be isolation from the rest of the world and from your loved ones right now, but there is no isolation from God. Will you join me in prayer? I invite you to close your eyes or focus on a Christ candle and pray with me for just a few moments right where you are. And if you're afraid of feeling silly because you're praying in front of a computer monitor, don't worry, no one is watching you right now. I'll pray and I'll leave you a few moments to continue on your own. Holy One, we may feel alone and isolated in these moments, but you, Holy God, see what is unfolding in our world. You see us, each and every one of us, for you are creator of all things. Although the world can sometimes seem dark, scary, and lonely, you call us to live and carry out good works in this time and place. Help us to trust in your presence. You have promised that you would be with us here always, until the ends of the earth, past the end of time, every step of the way. Make yourself clearly known to us, Divine Spirit. Thank you for joining me this evening. Be safe and be well. And I would like to end with a benediction. May our Creator God sustain you. May you know the peace of Christ in every moment, from moments of darkness to moments of joy. And may the power of God's Spirit be made evident in your life today and in all the days to come. Amen.